Welcome to the first of our two-part series on General José de San Martín, the true liberator of South America. In this video, we explore the political climate of late 18th century Spain and its relationship with its colonies. We'll follow a young San Martín as his family moves in search of a better life from the jungles of modern-day Argentina to Spain, where he is schooled as a cadet in the Murcia regiment, eventually rising through the ranks in the baptism of fire that was Napoleon's invasion of Spain during the Peninsular Wars. We'll see how the chaos of this war caused the simmering friction of the colonies to erupt into outright rebellion and awaken a new spirit of patriotism among colonials serving in Spain, who determined to return home and participate in the liberation of their native homeland. José Francisco de San Martín y Matoras was an Argentine general and regional governor who led his nation's army during the War of Independence from Spain, enabling in the process not only the liberation of Chile, Peru, but also modern Ecuador and Bolivia. While revered as El Libertador, to the wider world he remains the forgotten hero of Latin American independence, being overshadowed by the emphasis of historians on the activities of Colombian nobleman Simón Bolívar. In this video, we'll take a look at why this is, and hopefully help to restore San Martín to his rightful place in the Legion of Heroes in the Age of Enlightenment that shaped the modern world and the values we hold dear. San Martín was born on the 25th of February 1778 in Chapaju, Corrientes province in modern-day Argentina, which, at the time, was a Guarani Indian reduction, or outpost, in the jungles of northern Argentina, which was itself then part of the larger viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. He was the fifth and youngest child of Juan, a minor Spanish official, and his wife, Gregoria Matoras del Ser. Seeing little prospect of promotion in the remote wilderness, Juan packed up his young family and moved to Buenos Aires, where he fared little better, so the ever-ambitious father requested yet another transfer, finally moving them all back to Spain in 1783. Juan's ambitions remained unfulfilled even here, and his career stagnated, so they moved once again from Madrid to Malaga, where young José, by nature reserved, observant and intelligent, attended elementary school until he was accepted into the Murcia Infantry Regiment College as a cadet when he turned 11. The stability, regularity and camaraderie of military life suited him so much that by the age of 15 he was promoted to a sub-lieutenant and saw active duty in North Africa, fighting the Moors in Melilla and Oran. By 17 he was a full lieutenant, and by 19 had led troops in action during the War of the Second Coalition, where Spain and Napoleon's French Republic were allied and at war with Britain, and for that matter pretty much everyone else. At this time he was seconded to the Spanish Navy, participating in a number of engagements against the British, and eventually becoming a prisoner of war when the ship he was serving on was captured. His time in captivity was short, however, the British treating him well, and leaving a lasting impression on him when he was returned to Spain in a prisoner exchange. He went straight back into action, fighting in Cadiz and Gibraltar, distinguishing himself such that he was raised to the rank of second captain in the light infantry. Transferred to the west coast in 1801, he fought against the Portuguese in the War of the Oranges, essentially a Spanish land grab instigated by Napoleon, ostensibly to force the Portuguese to end their support and supply of the British. By 1804, he had proven his skill and loyalty such that he was promoted to full captain, and was now allowed to move within higher circles, being exposed to the influence of philosophy, scientific and political ideas emerging from the Spanish Enlightenment. While still solidly Catholic, Spain nevertheless benefited from the reforms and ideas implemented by their French Bourbon monarchy, who sought to reverse the decline in power and prestige that were the hallmark of the preceding Habsburg monarchs. This proved to be an important time in the development of his political thinking, while Napoleon's reorganization of the French army also influenced his attitude to army tactics and battle doctrine. After the disastrous defeat of the combined Franco-Spanish fleet by Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Portugal, sensing weakness, once again opened its ports to the British and resumed their alliance with them. Napoleon, incensed, demanded that the Portuguese close their ports to Britain and honour their treaty with him. The Portuguese court refused, and so Napoleon began planning another invasion of Portugal. In secret, Napoleon's agents this time plotted a total carve-up of the country that would give the entire southern third to Spain as a deal sweetener that would secure Spanish involvement in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. However, there was trouble in Spain. The Enlightenment movement that was taking hold on the continent was largely the result of progressive French intellectual influence. The raging success of Napoleon in destroying Prussia and neutralizing Austria and Russia caused liberal French ideas and fashion to spread far and wide. There was a growing feeling among the intelligentsia in Madrid that the suppression of church authority, abolition of the Inquisition, and adoption of French models of innovation would spur a modernization and prosperity in Spain that would restore its prestige on the international stage. Consequently, the ruling class in Madrid seemed ever more French-like in their mannerisms and in their dress, which led to widespread disaffection among ordinary Spanish subjects who feared an erosion of their own proud cultural identity. Some nobles voiced their concerns and made secret overtures to the British, which were intercepted by spies that gave Napoleon all the pretext he needed to fix the problems in Spain. All this while he would be taking care of the Portugal issue. So it was that by November 1807, Lisbon was again occupied by the French, with the help of Spanish troops, causing the entire Portuguese royal court to flee in disarray to their Brazilian colonies. In February of 1808, fresh French troops marched into Spain, supposedly on their way to Portugal, but instead marching into and occupying the fortresses of Pamplona and Barcelona in the process. The Spanish government demanded an explanation, which, being unsatisfactory, put them in a dilemma and caused chaos in the Spanish court. It was now Spain's turn to bear Napoleon's fury. As castle after castle fell, insurrection flared across the countryside, with French troops and their Spanish sympathizers suppressing the uprisings and burning entire towns, in massacres that influenced the work of a generation of traumatized Spanish artists like Goya. Finally surrounded, the Spanish king Charles IV, as well as his son Ferdinand VII, were forced to abdicate their claims to the crown, and Napoleon installed his own brother Joseph as King of Spain. The whole of Spain now erupted into rebellion, and cities were in flames everywhere. Guerrilla warfare broke out throughout the countryside and was instrumental in tying down and demoralizing French troops that were sorely needed elsewhere. Portugal, seeing another chance at freedom, soon exploded into open revolt against France as well. By mid-1808, the Peninsular War, as it is now known, was in full motion. Napoleon's armies had suffered their first substantial defeats and had surrendered 5 ships of the line along with an entire French army corps to the Spanish. These victories signalled that the French were beatable and reverberated throughout Europe, forming the seed of the next anti-Napoleon coalition. By August of 1808, British troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington had landed in Portugal and began reinforcing Portuguese and Spanish forces. Not to be outdone, Napoleon ordered tens of thousands more troops into the fray, clawing back one city after another, only to lose them again. Eventually, they began to recapture much of southern Spain, forcing the patriotic forces to hole up in Cadiz, an unassailable fortress that was now reinforced by the British Royal Navy in its harbour. From here, the remnant Regency Council, or junta, plotted its overthrow of Joseph and the reinstallation of the rightful king, either Charles IV or his son, Ferdinand VII. The next 3 years saw 500,000 soldiers slogging it out in battle after battle, campaign after campaign, across the entire Iberian Peninsula, with burning, looting and pillaging causing a catastrophic collapse of the entire Spanish economy and infrastructure. The Spanish court, and even ordinary citizens, were torn between the patriots and the Francophiles, and a civil war that made the murders and horror of Franco's 1936 civil war pale in significance. By the end of 1812, Napoleon had been entirely distracted by the disaster of his Russian campaign, and had left his generals and brother Joseph to deal with what he called the festering sore of the Peninsular War. The attrition now began to shift slowly in favour of the Allies, as by mid-1813 Napoleon was transferring troops from Spain to shore up his position in Eastern Europe, nervous about rebellions in the wake of his catastrophic defeat by the Russian winter. Slowly, Allied gains and French fatigue caused a fighting retreat of the French forces back into France, with King Joseph shamefully being among the first to leave, as the Cadiz junta broke out of its encirclement and gradually re-established control over the Spanish cities. British troops began to be transferred to America to shore up forces fighting against the United States in its ongoing disputes in Canada. With reprisals aplenty, all the afrancesados, or French collaborators as they were termed, who managed to escape with their lives, were exiled to France, but the chaos was far from over. The ruling junta was itself comprised of both the traditional loyalists, who were for a return of the absolute monarchy of the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties, and those who had a more liberal idea about Spain's future, with a desire for a constitutional monarchy and a well-written constitution to protect the interests of the people. When Napoleon initially deposed Charles and Ferdinand, he also set about reforming the Spanish Parliament along Republican and Enlightenment lines. He abolished church power and made all citizens equal before the law. Perhaps most significantly, he enabled a substantial representation of delegates from the colonies of Latin America and the Philippines, recognizing their aspirations for greater equality and more autonomy. As the war dragged on, many of the sitting deputies saw the benefit of these changes and became convinced that they were worth keeping, some even harbouring republican aspirations. During its time in Cadiz, the remnant Regency junta reformed its sitting legislature or parliament. It was comprised largely of these progressive delegates, with significantly fewer clergy or conservative voices. Furthermore, the presence of British forces, and hence ideas in the city, also had a shaping influence on the nature of this government in waiting, as long and interesting conversations were had behind the protective walls of the fortress. So it was that a constitution was eventually drafted, being amongst the first of its kind in the world. While it recognized Ferdinand as the legitimate ruler of Spain, it significantly curtailed his power and that of the Church, while vesting ultimate control in ministers of Parliament. It granted citizenship and voting rights to all subjects, even indigenous peoples and mixed-race ones, granting civil rights to free blacks, though not quite abolishing institutional slavery. It also called for a decentralisation of government control and greater self-determination in the dominions. This lean towards federalism, as well as offshore autonomy, now swayed the balance of power in the Parliament away from Spanish paternalism and into the hands of overseas dominions, upon whose resources, trade, and money the Spanish crown now heavily depended. Many of the nobility in the homeland found this distasteful. When Ferdinand VII, who had been a hostage of Napoleon during the entire war, was eventually restored to the throne in 1814, he initially promised to uphold this new constitution, but over the next couple of months, encouraged by disaffected loyalists and disempowered clergy who were keen to restore their own position and fortune through a return to the old regime, he abolished the constitution and restored power, titles, and privileges to those who supported an absolute monarchy. The result was 2 decades of civil strife, more bloodshed, persecution, and intrigue, with the constitution being alternately abolished and reinstated at least 7 times. It was in this crucible of political greed and chaos that our protagonist, José de San Martín, a young officer of impeccable loyalty, bravery, and reputation, now found himself. At the outbreak of the French invasion during the Peninsular War in 1808, he was made an adjutant general of a dragoon regiment, serving under his friend Francisco Solano Ortiz, governor of Andalusia. Ortiz was reluctant to use his troops to support the local anti-French uprising, which led to his being killed by a mob, exposing the young San Martín to the conflicting and confronting distress of duty versus conscience. As the war spiraled out of control, he was tasked with raising and leading a battalion of volunteers in Andalusia. He led from the front and in a valiant charge was almost killed at the Battle of Arconilla, but was saved from a cavalry sabre blow by a sergeant who threw himself between San Martín and the charging French officer. This near-death experience seemed to have a lasting effect on him, being saved by the sacrifice of an ordinary soldier, and made him much more considerate of the sacrifices they all make. So for the rest of his career, he took great pains to limit pointless waste of his troops' lives. His experience in recruiting volunteers for guerrilla campaigns was to have a lasting impact on his military thinking, as it expanded his notions of warfare beyond that of traditional units, and it influenced his admiration for the independent provincial warlords such as Güemes and Artigas on the Argentine and Uruguayan plains. But we'll come back to them later. You may recall mention of the battle in which an entire French army corps was routed and forced to surrender, along with 5 ships of the line. San Martín played a significant role in cutting off the enemy and contributing to that massive victory, which was to earn him a gold medal and a promotion to lieutenant colonel. However, by mid-1811, fortune once again began to favour the French, and San Martín found himself in a fighting withdrawal under the command of British General William Carr Beresford, from whom he learned much about organisation and logistics. At the Battle of Albuera, the combined Spanish and British forces held off the advance of the French, and though losses were heavy on both sides, they temporarily prevailed on the French to withdraw. It was considered to be the first example of a successful Anglo-Spanish coordinated action, given the traditional hostility between them, and San Martín admired the fighting spirit of the British. Despite this costly victory, the seemingly endless French reinforcements coming in from the continent eventually forced the Allies to retreat to the south, with San Martín reporting to Cadiz. The French now reoccupied the entire southern part of the peninsula, with the exception of a couple of besieged enclaves. It was during his time in Cadiz that San Martín became increasingly anxious about the internal strife that he could see was coming, with the absolutists and the liberals of the Regency Council arguing over the new articles of the Constitution and how much power was to be restored to the monarchy and how much to the people. As a criollo, or colonial, trying to make a name for himself on the Spanish peninsula, he must have surely felt the condescension of these European Spaniards, termed peninsulares, his whole life, a frustrating humiliation that is typical of all colonial aspirants. The experiences of American, Australian, South African and other British colonials has been well documented and is paralleled by those of the Latin world. It also seems that the further away from the ancestral culture a colony lies, the more alienating and condescending the mother country often is. When you think about how dependent and vulnerable fledgling colonies are on supply and protection, this comes as no surprise. The home country usually views its colonies as lawless, unruly, and unsophisticated burdens that need to be managed and ruthlessly kept in check. As time goes on, however, colonies eventually develop and mature through hardship and toughness to their local circumstances, and they begin to develop a hybrid culture of their own. They still maintain a degree of inferiority complex, yearning for the sophistication and finery of Europe, but by that stage, dependency usually begins to flow the other way, as the home culture becomes dependent on the exploitation of colonial resources, manpower and support, in a reversal of fortunes that seems to be typical throughout history. Despite this reversal, the paternalistic and condescending attitude towards colonials persists, causing friction. There always comes a tipping point, usually in the shape of demands for greater recognition, autonomy and representation in exchange for continuing exploitation. This rarely ever happens, of course, as condescending governments rarely see their colonies as equals, even when they themselves are on life support. In the United States, this dissatisfaction resulted in a revolutionary war of independence. In Canada and Australia, somewhat later, federalisation and the formation of a Commonwealth sufficiently satisfied the aspirations for autonomy of those countries, and they became independent nations without any resort to conflict. In Latin America, things were, as usual, much more complex, but they were definitely going the way of revolution. Let's rewind our timeline just a little and shift our attention to South America, just to provide some added context moving forward. You may recall at the outset of this video, we mentioned that before Napoleon's troops occupied Pamplona and Barcelona in 1808, France was actually in an alliance with Spain. This meant that both Spain and France were at war with Britain, as well as Portugal, who initially submitted to French demands to close their ports to the British. Remember that 18-year-old San Martín was captured by the British Navy and released sometime later in a prisoner exchange. While our young protagonist was busy in Spain, aiding the French and fighting the Portuguese, the British had turned their attention to the raiding of Spanish colonial shipping lanes and attacking their outposts in the Americas. The fact was that the British had long eyed the continent of South America as a prize, hoping not only to wrest control of several key ports from the Spanish for their own use, but also to plunder the resource-rich interior for themselves, like they were doing in Africa. At the same time, South America was a hostile, largely isolated, largely uninhabited continent, with only a few key ports on the east and the west coast, separated by a vast interior plain, jungles, and a huge mountain range that ran like a spine down the length of the west coast. This made communication, movement, and coordinated defence awfully slow. To make matters worse, large indigenous populations in several parts of the continent were prone to rebellion and were difficult to suppress, requiring troops to be dispersed through the countryside and leaving ports less well defended. In other words, cities were ripe for the picking. The British had recently lost their lucrative holdings in North America as the fledgling United States emerged victorious in their own war of independence. So they were looking to take possession of new territory further south and deny their enemy the Spanish access to the wealth of gold and other resources that propped up their regime. The British had particularly fixated their own colonial ambitions on the Rio de la Plata estuary, bordered on the north by Montevideo, in modern-day Uruguay, and in the south by Buenos Aires, as a potential territory for conquest. At the time, all of Spanish South America was divided into large, poorly connected viceroyalties, disinterestedly governed by peninsulares sent from Spain, whose avarice and disdain for colonials gave them little cause to invest in the development of their cities or the prosperity of the local population. Their prime concern was for the profits they could extract for themselves to curry favour with the king back home. Criollos, locally born colonials, were outwardly considered unsophisticated ruffians, unqualified to hold positions of responsibility or authority, but perhaps more secretly, their numbers made them a potential threat to the imperial power structure and a potential secession risk that needed to be managed. With all the Enlightenment nonsense that was gripping France and America, the risk of allowing criollos to have any voice in government was far too risky. Of course, developing those colonies into a thriving and prosperous commonwealth might have assuaged those fears, but typically the greed and short-sightedness that is synonymous with absolute monarchies usually sees a doubling down on exploitation of their subjects and punitive measures that eventually lead to civil unrest and bloodshed. Buenos Aires, then a city of 45,000 people, was the capital of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, a huge, poorly defined territory that encompassed all of modern-day Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and parts of southern Brazil. In 1805, Lord Nelson had completely annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar, making the Royal Navy the undisputed power in the Atlantic and severely curtailing any hope of communication and supply between Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula. The entire continent of South America was now isolated from Spain and vulnerable to British attack. Prime Minister William Pitt had already long consented to the support of Venezuelan revolutionary leader Francisco de Miranda, who proposed to lead rebellions throughout the colonies and place them under British protection. But by 1804, this looked to be too complex a task, and the British chose to focus instead on occupying lucrative key ports in the Americas. So with the sharks circling and local governors too self-absorbed and lacking support from Madrid to develop security in their towns and cities, in 1806 the British launched a bold amphibious assault on the thriving Spanish colonial outpost of Buenos Aires, the capital of modern Argentina. The Viceroy, the Marquis de Sobremonte, having previously requested troops from Spain, was totally unprepared for the attack, having sent his few soldiers elsewhere to quell indigenous unrest and fortifying Montevideo instead, believing that any British attack would happen there, which left Buenos Aires, a city with 45,000 citizens, virtually defenseless. Instead of sending troops, the king had sent only a few thousand muskets. Having long alienated the local criollo population, the Viceroy was reluctant to arm the populace, fearing a rebellion more than a British invasion. Thus, on the 25th of June 1806, the British landed one infantry regiment, an artillery battalion, and took Buenos Aires within 48 hours, encountering minimal resistance. While several peninsulares, including the Viceroy, fled the city to inland Córdoba, the majority of the population seemed either indifferent or even welcoming of the British, who promised to respect the rights of its citizens. They remained in control for over 2 months, until several criollo leaders, notably Manuel Belgrano, Juan Pueyrredón, and Santiago Linier, expressed the opinion that they should be either ruled by their old masters or none at all, which many historians have taken to imply a veiled ambition for self-rule and independence from Spain altogether. These three formed a ragtag group of militias of local citizenry, and together with a few hundred veterans, began skirmishing with the British, until eventually they forced the invaders, who were yet to receive reinforcements and supplies, to evacuate, with the treasure that they had managed to plunder from the city's coffers. The result was the formation of a ruling council, or junta, composed entirely of local criollo leaders, While nominally still loyal to the crown, one of their first resolutions was to depose the viceroy, who was increasingly viewed as having abandoned his duty to the city. The divide between criollos and peninsulares was now becoming more pronounced than ever, as it became increasingly evident that the motherland had neither the resources nor the willpower to protect its subjects in the colonies. They would have to take matters into their own hands, which ultimately was leading many to wonder why they shouldn't take all matters into their own hands and declare independence from Spain, in the same way they had just watched the Americans of the United States recently do. Fearing another British invasion, the council formed a permanent militia and began fortifying the city without the assistance or the direction of Madrid, who still feared secession more than they did the British. And, true to form, they invaded again, a year later, in 1807. This time, the city council was better prepared and had drilled its militia and prepared reasonable defences that cost thousands of British lives, including scores of officers, as civilians, slaves, women and children fought off the elite 71st Regiment of Foot in street-to-street fighting, with reports of women pouring boiling oil and rocks from rooftops, while soldiers encountered snipers around every corner looking to pick off their officers. Many British deserted, and some would go on to remain in Buenos Aires and fight with the newly formed militias in the years to come. Liniers, a criollo, was now made viceroy in an historic attempt to placate the masses and prevent what was now slowly becoming inevitable. With the euphoria and pride of having twice fought off a powerful foreign enemy without any aid, spread the inevitable belief that the time had now come for them to take charge of their own destiny. During this time, if you remember, Spain and France had just overrun Portugal, causing its entire court to flee to Brazil. Now that the Portuguese capital had shifted to Rio de Janeiro, the Spanish cities in the south of Brazil became even more nervous, as they had to contend not only with the British Navy, but also a highly likely Portuguese invasion on land from the north. Spain's covetousness of a bit of territory in Portugal had placed their colonies in South America at great risk, and none of them seemed to care. Revolutionary murmurings continued to simmer. By 1808, Napoleon had double-crossed his allied Spain, occupied several cities, and precipitated the uprisings that turned the Spanish into enemies. Latin American leaders sighed their relief, as the British and Portuguese were no longer a threat to them. In fact, they found the British far more helpful and supportive than Spain had ever been. Their new friends the British sensed the spirit of revolution in the air and were only too happy to help them along their way, as Spain became entirely immersed in its war of liberation against Napoleon and abandoned Latin America to its fate. The complex love-hate relationship between the United Kingdom and Argentina that was now emerging was a passionate and fiery tango that would last to this very day. The final straw came when Napoleon forced the abdication of both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. This was something that the entire colonial dominions found repulsive. There was some debate on whether the sister of Ferdinand, Carlota Joaquina, might rule the continent as regent until the rightful king was restored to the throne. But her husband was a prince of Portugal, now in Brazil, and there was little support from either the populace or the duplicitous British, who were gaining greater influence on the policies of the local councils and only too pleased to keep the crown as far away from Latin America as possible. Disgruntled peninsulares had by now returned to Buenos Aires and, angered by the amount of autonomy afforded to criollo businesses and municipal councils, began an uprising of their own, which was quickly put down by the liberal-minded criollo viceroy Liniers. Back in Cadiz on the Spanish mainland, the Regency Council, on the run and hiding from Napoleon, saw this as a threat and sent a new, more subservient peninsular viceroy to replace Liniers, whom they accused of actually being a secret French sympathizer. The patricians in Buenos Aires were now indignant and found this meddling by a self-appointed Regency Council, whose own legitimacy was questionable, to be offensive, and recommended Liniers oppose the handover of power, but he did not believe the time was yet ripe for such an action, which would signify an unmistakable act of rebellion. So, dutifully, he installed his appointed successor, Baltasar Hidalgo Cisneros, without incident. At first, the new viceroy tried to conciliate the factions, allowing free trade concessions and even allowing Liniers, a hero, to remain in the city. But small mutinies and rebellions began to pop up all around the countryside, which were ruthlessly put down by Cisneros' troops, with public beheadings and reprisals for the town leaders that supported them. The viceroy became increasingly hard-line as the civil unrest grew, drafting laws and edicts to pursue and banish suspects of secession, and this only served to accelerate the provocation into open rebellion. All crown legitimacy now gone in the eyes of the people, the local city council in Buenos Aires, called the Cabildo, voted to abolish the position of viceroy and form self-government. Some calls were made to make a conciliatory provision for the deposed viceroy and install him as president with his officers as deputies within the house. But local hardline patriots stormed the building and demanded an end to royalist control of their country. They insisted on a disbanding of all unpatriotic institutions. Cisneros, under pressure, resigned and was banished back to Spain, but not before charging his predecessor, Santiago Liniers, now retired and living in the interior, to restore order and retake the city in the name of the crown. Liniers, if you recall, was already a national hero, a criollo who had liberated Buenos Aires twice from the invasions of the British in 1806 and 1807. Having been made a viceroy, he ruled with fairness and sympathy to the claims of his compatriots. But as he watched Buenos Aires descend into chaos and violence, and then spread to other towns across the region, he was moved to act to restore order. It seems probable that he still didn't feel the time was ripe, or the people ready to take charge of their own destiny. But whatever his deepest feelings were, his move to raise a militia to retake the capital marked him now as a traitor, and his mostly unsympathetic troops soon deserted him. Suddenly finding himself with few supporters, he was quickly captured and unceremoniously executed without trial to prevent any possibility of his reputation influencing the direction of the revolution, which was now in full swing. News of both this chaos and euphoria now reached San Martín, stuck in Cadiz, among the squabbling Spanish elites who were plotting the future of Spain despite the fact it was totally occupied by Napoleon's army, with no end in sight. He had spent his entire youth and career fighting for a king who was nowhere to be seen, and for a government that seemed incapable of restoring its own sovereignty. He felt Spanish enough, and was a lieutenant colonel, among the highest ranking of all criollos in the war, but as an immigrant son of a minor official from the jungle, he was under no illusions of his being a second-class citizen, with limited opportunities for the future, like his father, who had died some years ago without making any real progress in life. Meanwhile, his people back home in the colonies had taken their future into their own hands. He knew all about the exploitation, discrimination and abandonment they were enduring. He had by now made a few new friends in Cadiz, other criollo thinkers, and a couple of British officers, who related the situation back home and the events of the invasions of 1806 and 7 that swelled his breast with pride. At this time, many free thinkers organized themselves into lodges, loosely based along Freemason lines, to discuss issues of liberty, freedom of conscience, and other dangerous notions that could end their careers and possibly also their lives. San Martín, already a Freemason since 1808, now came into contact with other Masons in Cadiz, such as Scotsman Lord Duff and General Francisco Solano, who promoted the interests of independence in South America. Other criollos were now also drawn to the group that eventually became known as the Lautaro Lodge, in honor of a Mapuche Indian freedom fighter, a secret society dedicated at first to the promotion of Enlightenment ideals, but then, more specifically, to the liberation of the Latin American continent. He was joined in this society by other notable companions. Carlos Maria de Alvear, son of a nobleman who, though not as distinguished as San Martin, was also a professional soldier, as well as being an ambitious political thinker. There was also José Matias Zapiola, a naval officer, and Francisco Chilavert, who would go on to play significant roles in the independence of their future nation. Among this group of isolated and marginalized criollos, discussion soon turned to the future of both Spain and its colonies, with the now helpless and marooned officers eventually coming to the conclusion that their knowledge and skills would be best employed in the creation of a new, independent South American nation, built along the model of the United States, with freedom and prosperity for its people, rather than exploitation solely for the benefit of, in San Martin's words, a tyrannical peninsular government. He decided to resign his commission in the army, causing a scandal, and sailed with his companions to London, where he was introduced to other revolutionaries, notably the Venezuelans Francisco de Miranda and Simón Bolívar, who were already fighting for independence on their own home fronts. San Martin and his companions now set sail for Buenos Aires, arriving on the British frigate George Canning in March of 1812. By this time, the fledgling government in Buenos Aires had reached out to other cities within the huge viceroyalty to acknowledge their government and send their own deputies to the Cabildo. However, the function of such deputies, their allegiance, and their role in any wider government was still unclear, so most cities and regions rejected its authority and legitimacy. Montevideo to the north was by now highly fortified and a naval stronghold, so was declared the new capital of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, infuriating the junta in Buenos Aires, who initially saw themselves as protecting the sovereignty of the people in the absence of the king. These disputes about sovereignty and what constitutes the people would plague Latin American politics for decades after the end of the War of Independence and be the cause of much ongoing violence and civil strife. Nevertheless, in May of 1810, the junta declared itself as the legitimate administration of the newly named United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. Having failed to acquire the submission of the provinces by message, it wasn't long before Buenos Aires sent militias out into the provinces to demand their subordination. But these expeditions failed miserably. In the north, having been thrashed in their attempt to conquer the territory around Paraguay, the leadership was surprised to learn shortly after that, inspired by their own example, Paraguay itself declared total independence from Spain and offered the United Provinces a non-aggression treaty instead. For the time being, this was an expedient solution and allowed the United Provinces to focus their attention on subduing the regions to the north bordering the Viceroyalty of Peru, and that of the northeast beyond Montevideo, that came to be called the Banda Oriental, still strongly royalist, suspicious of their neighbours' motives, and posing a huge threat of counterattack due to their large flotilla of ships. The irony is that the government of the United Provinces was still, at the time, not a separatist entity, and considered itself a government ruling in the name of the rightful king. They disputed the authority of the Regency Council and its remnant body in Cadiz as being illegitimate, and, outwardly anyway, saw themselves as legitimately ruling in the name of Ferdinand. This was not only scoffed at by the other regions, who viewed it as a cover for a straight-up power grab, but also by factions within the Cabildo, or Parliament, itself, whose deputies ranged from nominally royalist to those favouring a constitutional monarchy, to outright Republicans who would accept nothing other than a totally independent state. What's more, prominent figures like Mariano Moreno, a lawyer and journalist who were initially against the removal of the viceroy, became incensed at the attempts to just reshuffle the deck while leaving him and his cronies effectively still in power. Disgruntled, they now flipped and became implacable and paranoid Republican secessionists. On the other hand, initially progressive and patriotic leaders such as Gregorio Funes and Cornelio Saavedra foresaw a descent of the city into a French-style Jacobin reign of terror, thus becoming more moderate and conciliatory towards monarchist sympathies. They were hoping that such a compromise might promote order and stable government. The simmering tensions within this ill-defined government continued to ebb and flow, sometimes violently, as delegates in the Cabildo jockeyed for numbers to maintain control of the junta. Several expeditions sent by the still disorganized regime in Buenos Aires into the unyielding and autonomous neighboring provinces ended in complete failure and a stalemate that eventually saw the dissolution of the junta as an executive organ, leaving it to function purely in its legislative capacity. In its place, the Cabildo formed an executive triumvirate of 3 prominent local politicians. The trouble was that all 3 of these leaders were wealthy residents of Buenos Aires and completely opposed to any form of provincial autonomy, forcing all commerce to ply through the port of the capital. They promptly began dismantling local branches of government in the outlying towns and cities and appointed governors directly from Buenos Aires. This move to centralization of power, which came to be known as the Unitario, while in some sense was a logical response to the inefficiency and failures of the previous junta to coordinate provinces and act swiftly and decisively, was nevertheless interpreted as discriminatory to the interests of all the other provinces, who demanded trade rights and tariff concessions on a par with the capital. The push by other provinces for a federated, congressional approach to government was largely driven by the caudillos, extremely wealthy regional landowners, whose gauchos, or cowboys, formed the backbone of their private militias, making them, in effect, powerful regional warlords. Amongst their greatest champions was José Gervasio Artigas, a patriot, infantry captain, and sometime cattle rustler who was both a Republican and a Federalist. Along with Artigas, there was also Francisco Ramirez and Estanislao López, Martín Miguel de Güemes, and others. They eventually formed an oppositional confederation known as the Union of Free Peoples, or in Spanish, the Liga Federal. Artigas, in his fight for provincial rights, would eventually come to be regarded as the father of Uruguay. At first, the central government in Buenos Aires tried to curry favor with Artigas and the other Federalistas, as they could at least rely on their patriotic tendencies in the War of Independence. They offered them titles and rewards to help them wrest Montevideo and other cities from the hands of the monarchists, but usually double-crossed them at every opportunity, hoping to eliminate both the monarchists and the Federalistas to ensure that power remained firmly in the hands of the porteños, or the patricians of Buenos Aires as they were known. It was into this mess that San Martín and his companions disembarked in March of 1812. A city that was trying to intimidate all the others into submission, a fledgling parliament divided over what it really stood for, or what shape it should take, civilians leading largely disastrous military campaigns, and a childish political culture that perpetuated a merry-go-round of successive leaders, exiling or executing outgoing ones on trumped-up charges of treason. Join us next video as we follow San Martin's incredible career, from his army crossing the Andes, battles for the liberation of Chile, siege and liberation of Peru, his link-up with Bolívar, antagonisms back home, and finally his self-imposed exile after liberation of the continent.